The golden rays of the early morning sun cast a warm glow over the bustling city square. Jack, a 16-year-old black teenager with tight curls and a determined gaze, sat on an old wooden bench, his worn-out sneakers tapping restlessly on the cobblestone ground. This spot was his refuge, a place where he could escape the weight of daily life. The relentless schoolwork, the worries about money at home, and the uncertainty that often crept into his thoughts. Today, however, was different. There was a certain tension in the air, a feeling Jack couldn't quite shake off. The square was alive with life. Children raced around the bubbling fountain, their laughter ringing out like music. Street vendors called out, advertising their roasted chestnuts and fresh lemonade. The scent of fresh-baked bread from the nearby bakery mingled with the sharp tang of city air. It was the kind of scene that felt timeless, yet today it buzzed with an undercurrent Jack didn't recognize. He was about to pull out his sketchbook, a sanctuary for his art and dreams, when something caught his eye. Across the square, an elderly woman with snow-white hair and a gentle smile walked slowly toward a well-dressed man. Her movements were careful, deliberate, as though each step carried a story of resilience. Jack's curiosity sharpened when he saw the man lean in too close, gesturing with a polished pen and a paper that glistened in the sunlight. His smile was wide but strained, his eyes flickering with an edge Jack recognized, the same look some kids at school had before trying to pull a fast one. The young man's muscles tensed as he watched. The woman, whom he would soon learn was named Mrs. Eleanor, hesitated. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the pen, eyes darting from the man to the document in front of her. Jack's mind raced. He knew he had no reason to interfere. Who was he after all? Just a kid with worn-out clothes and big dreams? But his gut told him something was off. Before he realized what he was doing, Jack stood up. His heart thudded in his chest as he approached the pair, each step echoing louder in his ears. He forced himself to appear casual, just another passerby taking a stroll. But his eyes were locked on the man, whose polished shoes and tailored suit contrasted sharply with the rawness Jack felt in his own being. "Excuse me, ma'am, is everything all right here?" Jack's voice came out steady, a pleasant surprise given the storm inside him. The elderly woman looked up, surprise and a flicker of hope passing through her blue eyes. The man, whose name Jack would later know as Carter, turned slowly, his expression shifting from annoyance to calculation. "We're in the middle of an important transaction," Carter said smoothly, his voice a practiced mix of authority and charm. He shot Jack a condescending glance, as if daring him to persist. "Why don't you run along, kid?" Jack didn't move. He squared his shoulders, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm sure this can wait a moment. It's just that, these days, you can't be too careful with contracts, right?" His eyes locked with Carter's, a silent battle of wills. Around them, the noise of the square seemed to dim as curious eyes turned their way. The man's jaw clenched for a moment, then relaxed into a forced smile. "Of course, there's no harm in ensuring everything's in order," he said, his tone saccharine but laced with irritation. He tucked the papers into his briefcase, the gleam in his eyes turning cold. "Perhaps another time, Mrs. Eleanor." And with that he walked away, the sound of his polished shoes on the cobblestones echoing like a retreating storm. Mrs. Eleanor exhaled deeply, the tension in her shoulders easing as she turned to Jack. Her hands, adorned with delicate veins and the marks of a life well lived, reached out to touch his arm. "Young man, I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice wavering with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "You've done more than you know." Jack felt a rush of warmth spread through him, a strange mix of pride and disbelief. "It's nothing, ma'am. I just didn't want anything bad to happen," he said, scratching the back of his neck, suddenly aware of the onlookers who now shifted back to their routines. But before Mrs. Eleanor could say more, the moment was interrupted by a deep, commanding voice from the edge of the square. "What's going on here?" Jack turned to see a man in an impeccably tailored suit, his silver hair catching the sun, and eyes that radiated authority. This was Mr. Donovan, though Jack wouldn't know until much later that he was one of the most influential figures in the city, and that today's act of courage would alter the course of his life forever. The morning after the incident in the square, Jack woke up to the familiar hum of his neighborhood. The small apartment he shared with his mother, Clara, was filled with the scent of brewed coffee and the faint sound of a radio playing an old R&B song. Sunlight filtered through the cracked blinds, casting streaks of warmth on the faded wallpaper. Clara, dressed in her nurse's scrubs, moved about the tiny kitchen with a practiced efficiency, the weight of night shifts evident in the tired smile she offered her son. "Morning, Jack. You were out late yesterday," she said, handing him a plate of toast. There was a hint of curiosity in her voice, but she was used to her son's independent nature. Jack nodded, chewing thoughtfully as the memory of the day before replayed in his mind. The glint of Carter's eyes, the tremor in Mrs. Eleanor's hand, and the mysterious figure who had approached at the end. "It was nothing, Mom. Just got caught up in the usual," Jack said, his tone casual, but eyes betraying the whirlwind of thoughts he kept to himself. He didn't want to worry her, not when she already worked tirelessly to keep their world from tipping over. Moments later, Jack grabbed his worn backpack and headed out, the hinges of their front door creaking a familiar goodbye. The streets of the city were alive with the usual chaos. Honking horns, chatter from street vendors, and the rhythmic clatter of a distant train. As he walked, the urban soundtrack was interrupted by the buzzing of his phone. The screen lit up with a message from Ben, his best friend since kindergarten. "Dude, heard you saved some old lady yesterday? Spill it." Jack smiled, shaking his head at Ben's flair for exaggeration. Typing back a quick response, he promised to fill him in at school. The walk to the bus stop felt shorter than usual, his mind busy with questions. Who was that man who had appeared out of nowhere? And why did he look at Jack as if he recognized him? When Jack stepped into the classroom, Ben was waiting with an impatient grin, his blonde hair messily framing his face. "Jack the hero," Ben announced loudly, earning them both a few amused glances from their classmates. "Tell me everything. Did she give you a reward?" "Cookies." "Tell me it was cookies." Jack chuckled, settling into his seat. "No, Ben, no cookies. Just an intense moment. A guy who looked way too slick for his own good. And, I don't know, it felt strange," he admitted, a shadow of confusion crossing his face. Before Ben could respond with another of his usual jokes, the door to the classroom opened, and the familiar silhouette of Mr. Harris, the school principal, appeared. "Jack Smith, could you come with me, please?" Mr. Harris's expression was unreadable, his voice formal. A murmur swept through the room as Jack stood, exchanging a puzzled glance with Ben. The walk to the principal's office felt longer than usual, each step amplifying the unease in his chest. When he entered the office, the sight that met him was surreal. Mrs. Eleanor sat in one of the chairs, her elegant hands folded neatly on her lap. Beside her stood the man with silver hair, his gaze sharp and discerning. He wore an expensive suit that seemed to belong more in a boardroom than in a high school office. Mr. Harris cleared his throat. "Jack, this is Mrs. Eleanor and her grandson, Mr. Donovan." Jack's eyes widened. He hadn't expected to see them again, let alone in this context. Mrs. Eleanor's face lit up with a warm smile as she turned to him. "Jack, dear, I hope we didn't startle you. I wanted to introduce you to my grandson formally," she said, her voice as soft and comforting as he remembered. Mr. Donovan stepped forward, extending a firm hand. Up close, his presence was even more commanding, but there was a gentleness in his expression as he looked at Jack. "Jack, it's a pleasure to meet you under less tense circumstances," he said, a hint of a smile breaking through his serious demeanor. My grandmother told me about what you did yesterday. Stepping in to help someone you don't know takes a kind of courage that's rare these days. Jack's mind raced. The magnitude of what was happening began to sink in. He was standing in front of one of the city's most influential figures, known not just for his wealth, but for his philanthropic work and the vast empire he managed. "I just did what anyone would do," Jack said, his voice humble but steady. Mr. Donovan nodded, as if confirming something he already suspected. "Not everyone, Jack. And that's precisely why I'm here. I wanted to thank you personally and offer you an opportunity. I run a foundation that helps young people with potential, and I think you could be a perfect fit." The room seemed to hold its breath. Jack glanced at Mrs. Eleanor, who watched him with pride, and then back at Mr. Donovan. "An opportunity," he echoed, his heart thudding with anticipation and disbelief. "Yes," Mr. Donovan continued, "a chance to learn, to be mentored, and to gain experiences that could shape your future." He leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing with intent. "But first, we'll need to get to know each other better. How about dinner tomorrow night at my home? My grandmother insists on it, and trust me, she's hard to refuse." Jack couldn't help but smile, a rare warmth spreading through him as he nodded. "I'd be honored, sir." The weight of the moment settled over him. This was more than just a thank you. It was a doorway opening to possibilities he never imagined. As he walked back to class, still processing everything, the day felt brighter, the city more alive with potential. Ben's eyes widened as Jack returned, and before he could launch into a barrage of questions, Jack whispered, "Ben, you won't believe what just happened." And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt that maybe, just maybe, his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet fathom. The following day seemed to pass in slow motion. Jack woke up to the soft glow of dawn filtering through the thin curtains in his room. His heart thumped with anticipation as the reality of the dinner invitation settled in. The rhythmic sounds of the city outside were a reminder that life continued. But for Jack, this day felt like the start of something new, something he couldn't quite grasp yet. At breakfast, his mother, Clara, noticed the shift in his demeanor. "You're up earlier than usual, Jack," she remarked, pouring steaming coffee into her chipped mug. The shadows under her eyes spoke of another long shift at the hospital, but her smile was warm as always. Jack hesitated for a moment before sharing the news. "Mom, you'll never believe what happened yesterday," he began, setting his spoon down. He told her about Mrs. Eleanor, the unexpected visit to the principal's office, and Mr. Donovan's offer. Clara's eyes widened, her expression moving from surprise to pride, with a touch of worry creasing her brow. "Jack, that's incredible. But are you sure it's safe?" she asked, her voice laced with maternal concern. Jack reached for her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "I know it sounds too good to be true, Mom, but I think this could be my chance. Our chance." Clara's eyes softened, and she nodded, brushing away the beginnings of a tear. "Then go and show them the amazing young man I already know." The day dragged on as Jack tried to focus on schoolwork, but the upcoming dinner loomed large in his mind. Ben was relentless with his questions during lunch. "So, you're telling me you're going to dine with a Donovan? Dude, that's not just big, that's massive," Ben said, his excitement palpable. Jack chuckled, feeling a mix of nerves and anticipation. "Yeah, and I have no idea what to expect. It's like walking into a different world." When evening came, Jack stood in front of the small mirror in his room, adjusting the only button-up shirt he owned. It was slightly tight around the shoulders, a reminder of how much he had grown over the past year. Clara stood at the doorway, eyes filled with pride and a hint of nostalgia. "You look so grown up," she whispered, as if speaking more to herself than to him. A sleek black car pulled up outside their apartment building, and Jack's stomach flipped. The driver, a middle-aged man with a polite nod, opened the door. "Good evening, Mr. Smith. Mr. Donovan is expecting you." The ride through the city was surreal, each familiar landmark blurring past as the reality of the night sank in. The car turned into a gated driveway, revealing the Grand Donovan estate. The mansion stood tall and imposing, with ivy clinging to its stone walls and lights that made it glow like a beacon. As Jack stepped out, he was greeted by Mrs. Eleanor, who looked radiant in an elegant dress. "Jack, dear, welcome. I'm so glad you could make it," she said, enveloping him in a warm hug. The tension in his chest eased slightly. The entrance hall was a portrait of old-world luxury, marble floors, a grand staircase, and portraits of ancestors who seemed to watch his every move. Mr. Donovan appeared, dressed impeccably as always, but this time there was a hint of warmth in his eyes. "Jack, come in. I hope you're hungry," he said, guiding him to the dining room. The table was set for a small group, with dishes that looked like works of art. Jack took a seat, his eyes scanning the room, trying to take in every detail without seeming overwhelmed. The conversation started light. Small talk about school, his favorite subjects, and what he liked to do in his spare time. Mrs. Eleanor chimed in with stories from her youth, weaving in lessons about resilience and kindness. Jack relaxed, realizing that beneath the layers of wealth and influence, they were people who valued connection and loyalty. But as dinner progressed, Mr. Donovan's tone shifted slightly, growing more serious. "Jack, there's something you should know. This isn't just about a thank-you dinner," he began, folding his hands. "My grandmother means a world to me, and the fact that you stepped in to help her when no one else did speaks volumes. I'm looking for young people who have that kind of courage and integrity. People who can be leaders, not just followers." Jack's pulse quickened. He wasn't sure where this was leading, but every word carried weight. "I want to offer you a position in our mentorship program," Mr. Donovan continued. "It's more than just an internship. It's a path that could open doors to scholarships, hands-on projects, and connections that will shape your future." For a moment, Jack was speechless. The room seemed to close in, not from pressure, but from the overwhelming realization of what this could mean for him, and for his mother, who had sacrificed so much. I don't know what to say, sir. This is more than I ever dreamed of," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. Mr. Donovan's eyes softened. "Then say yes, Jack. We can start with a trial period, and if it's a good fit, we'll move forward. But know this, you'll have to work hard. I won't go easy on you just because of yesterday." Jack nodded, a determined smile breaking through. "I'm ready for that, sir. I won't let you down." Mrs. Eleanor reached across the table, placing a gentle hand on his. "We believe in you, Jack. This is just the beginning." As the evening wound down, the reality of the opportunity sank deeper into Jack's mind. Walking out into the cool night air, with the city stretching out before him, he felt a surge of hope and determination. This was more than a chance encounter. It was the first step toward a future he had dared to hope for, but never thought possible. The ride home was quiet, but Jack's mind was anything but. For the first time in a long time, he felt the stirrings of a dream that seemed within reach. And as the city lights blurred past, he whispered to himself, "This is just the beginning." The day after the dinner, Jack felt as if he were walking on air. The memories of the Grand Donovan estate, the opulent dinner, and the life-changing conversation replayed in his mind like a vivid movie. But reality awaited him at school, where the creaking lockers and the laughter of his classmates provided a stark contrast to the elegance of the previous night. Ben caught sight of him the moment he stepped through the doors and sprinted over, eyes wide with curiosity. "All right, Spill. How was the dinner? Did you meet any celebrities? Eat gold leaf pastas?" Ben joked, but his grin faltered when he noticed Jack's distant look. Jack took a breath and recounted everything: the estate, Mrs. Eleanor's warmth, and Mr. Donovan's offer. Ben's eyes grew as large as saucers as he processed the information. "No way. Jack, this is huge," Ben said, clapping his friend on the back. Jack chuckled, the excitement bubbling up again as he felt the gravity of the opportunity. But beneath it all, there was a tension he couldn't shake, a feeling that things were about to change in ways he wasn't prepared for. As classes trudged on, Jack struggled to focus. His mind drifted to what Mr. Donovan had said. "I won't go easy on you." Those words carried both promise and a warning. That evening, he received an email with instructions to report to the Donovan Foundation the next day after school. The message was precise, formal, and left no room for doubt. This was serious. When the following day came, Jack found himself standing in front of the towering Donovan Foundation building. Its sleek glass facade reflected the city skyline, and the entrance buzzed with activity. People in suits moved with purpose, their conversations blending into a low hum of ambition. Jack swallowed hard and pushed through the revolving door. Inside, the lobby was a masterpiece of modern design. Marble floors, high ceilings, and an art installation that twisted like a metal ribbon across the room. A receptionist with a polished smile directed him to the elevator. "Mr. Donovan is expecting you on the top floor," she said. The elevator ride felt endless, the numbers lighting up one by one until the final ding signaled his arrival. The door slid open to reveal a spacious office lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. Mr. Donovan stood by one of the windows, hands clasped behind his back. He turned as Jack stepped in, a smile breaking the tension of the moment. "Welcome, Jack. How was your day?" he asked, a casualness in his tone that put Jack at ease. Before Jack could respond, Mr. Donovan gestured for him to sit at the large mahogany desk. "I won't keep you long today, but there are a few things I want to discuss." Jack sat down, eyes darting around the room, taking in the shelves lined with books, awards, and photographs. One picture caught his eye, a younger Mr. Donovan shaking hands with another man in military uniform, both smiling as if sharing a private joke. Jack's attention snapped back as Mr. Donovan continued. "Our mentorship program is demanding, Jack. It's designed to push you, challenge you, and reveal what you're truly capable of. I need to know if you're ready for that." His eyes held Jack's with an intensity that demanded honesty. Jack felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "I am ready, sir," he replied, the resolve in his voice surprising even himself. "Your first assignment won't be glamorous," Mr. Donovan said, leaning back in his chair. "You'll start with assisting the team in archiving old projects and learning about our work from the ground up. It might seem tedious, but it's the best way to understand the breadth of what we do." Jack nodded, understanding that this was a test, not just of his skills, but of his patience and work ethic. As Mr. Donovan outlined the expectations, a knock on the door interrupted them. Mrs. Eleanor entered, her smile lighting up the room. "I couldn't resist popping in to see how our newest mentee is doing," she said, winking at Jack. The conversation took a lighter turn, with Mrs. Eleanor sharing stories of her younger days when she first ventured into the world of philanthropy. "It wasn't always balls and fundraisers, you know," she said, laughing. "I remember one time I had to chase down a missing shipment of supplies myself. You learn that true service is never without its challenges." Jack felt a warmth spread through him as she spoke. It was easy to see where Mr. Donovan got his values from. But before long, the conversation circled back to business. Mr. Donovan stood up, signaling that their meeting was wrapping up. "Jack, we start tomorrow. Come prepared and remember, we're investing in you because we see something special." As Jack left the office, the weight of responsibility settled more heavily on his shoulders. The ride down in the elevator was a whirlwind of emotions: excitement, nervousness, and an inkling of doubt. Was he really cut out for this? He pushed the thought aside, knowing that the only way to find out was to dive in and give it everything he had. Walking through the city streets back to his neighborhood, Jack noticed the subtle differences that marked his reality from the one he had just left. The cracked sidewalks, the sound of kids playing in the narrow alleys, and the distant thrum of music from a passing car. It was a reminder of where he came from and why this opportunity meant so much. When he got home, Clara was there, sitting on their old couch with a tired but genuine smile. "How was it, Jack?" she asked, patting the seat beside her. Jack sat down and recounted the day, his voice tinged with both excitement and trepidation. Clara listened intently, pride shining in her eyes. "You know, Jack, opportunities like this don't just come along. They're made. And I know you're going to make the most of it," she said, her voice steady and full of belief. Jack nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. This was the beginning of a journey that would test him in ways he couldn't yet imagine, but he was ready to face it head-on. And as the city lights blinked outside their window, Jack knew one thing for certain. This was more than a chance. It was a challenge, a call to become something greater, and he was determined not to let it slip through his fingers. The first week at the Donovan Foundation was a whirlwind. Jack spent hours sifting through files, archiving old projects, and familiarizing himself with the organization's vast scope of work. The office was a hive of activity, with professionals from all backgrounds moving swiftly, their conversations peppered with terms Jack was only beginning to understand. He was surrounded by innovation, philanthropy, and a level of professionalism that both inspired and intimidated him. Despite the mundane nature of his initial tasks, Jack was determined to prove himself. He meticulously documented each project, making mental notes of the ones that stood out: a youth outreach program in the inner city, a clean water initiative overseas. Each folder told a story of impact, and Jack felt a growing admiration for the work the foundation did. But beneath the excitement, there was a creeping unease he couldn't shake. One afternoon, as Jack sat at his desk flipping through documents, he overheard a conversation in the hallway. Two senior employees, their voices hushed but urgent, spoke in low tones. "We need to keep an eye on the Carter situation," one of them said. The other responded, "If he really has connections to those rival firms, Donovan could be in more danger than he realizes." Jack's heart skipped a beat. Carter. The name sent a chill down his spine, dragging him back to that moment in the square when he'd first seen the smooth-talking man trying to trick Mrs. Eleanor. What was Carter's connection to the Donovan Foundation? Jack's mind raced with questions. He knew he shouldn't jump to conclusions, but something told him that whatever was happening was bigger than just him, or even Mr. Donovan. That evening, Jack couldn't shake the unease. He met up with Ben at their usual hangout spot, a small park with rusted swings and an old basketball court. The two sat on the creaking swings, the metal chains groaning under their weight. Ben, ever the observant friend, noticed Jack's furrowed brow. "What's up, man? You've been quiet since you got here," Ben said, nudging Jack's arm with his elbow. Jack sighed, staring at the cracked pavement beneath his feet. "It's complicated, Ben. There's this guy named Carter. I overheard some stuff at the foundation, and I think he's up to something." Ben's expression shifted from playful to serious. "Carter, like the guy from Square? That's not good, Jack. What do you think he wants?" Jack shook his head. "I don't know, but it's bad news. I feel like there's more going on than Mr. Donovan or anyone else is letting on." The conversation hung in the air as the streetlights flickered to life, casting long shadows across the park. Jack's mind was a storm of doubts and theories, each more unsettling than the last. If Carter really was connected to rival firms, what did that mean for the foundation? And why did it seem like no one was taking it seriously enough? The next day at the foundation, Jack kept his ears open, listening for any mention of Carter. He caught snippets of conversations, most of them vague, but all pointing to something brewing beneath the surface. During lunch, he found himself in the break room with Lydia, a senior project manager known for her no-nonsense approach and sharp intuition. She had taken notice of Jack's dedication and often offered him advice. "Hey, Jack," Lydia said, breaking him out of his thoughts. "You're doing well for your first week. Most interns would have cracked under the pressure by now." Jack offered a small smile. "Thanks, Lydia. I'm just trying to learn as much as I can She narrowed her eyes slightly, sensing something. You seem distracted. Everything okay? Jack hesitated, debating whether to bring up Carter, but he trusted Lydia's judgment and knew she could be a valuable ally. I heard some people talking about Carter and rival firms. Does that have anything to do with the foundations? Lydia's expression darkened, and she glanced around to make sure no one else was listening. Carter is a name we don't take lightly around here. He's been involved in underhanded deals and has connections that could jeopardize everything we've built. But Jack, this isn't something you should be worrying about. Let Donovan and his team handle it. Jack nodded, but the warning did little to calm the storm inside him. The day wore on, each task feeling heavier as the pieces of a puzzle he didn't fully understand began to come together. As he packed up to leave for the day, Mr. Donovan appeared at his desk, his usual composed expression replaced with a slight frown. "Jack, can I have a word?" he asked, motioning for Jack to follow him to his office. The room felt different this time, as if the air itself was denser with the weight of unspoken words. Mr. Donovan closed the door behind them and turned, his eyes meeting Jack's with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "I know you've heard whispers about Carter," Mr. Donovan began, his voice low. "And I won't lie to you. He's a threat, not just to this foundation, but to everyone involved. We're taking precautions, but I need you to stay focused and trust that we're handling it." Jack swallowed hard, the urge to ask more bubbling up, but he held back. "Yes, sir. I understand," he said, though the tension in his chest didn't ease. Mr. Donovan's gaze softened, and he placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. "I brought you here because I see potential in you, Jack. But I also need you to be careful. Some things are more dangerous than they seem." As Jack left the office that evening, the city seemed darker, the usual hum of life tinged with an edge of danger. He knew that whatever storm was coming, he was now part of it. The question was, would he be ready when it hit? The city's glow bathed the Donovan Foundation building in hues of amber and silver as the last employees trickled out for the evening. Jack sat alone in the break room, the soft hum of the vending machine and the ticking clock the only sounds punctuating the silence. The words of Mr. Donovan echoed in his mind. "Be careful. Some things are more dangerous than they seem." The cryptic warning gnawed at him, raising more questions than it answered. The door creaked open, and Lydia stepped in, carrying a stack of files. Her sharp eyes landed on Jack, and she raised an eyebrow. "You're still here." Most interns would have run home by now. Jack managed a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just trying to stay ahead," he replied, his voice trailing off. Lydia set the files down on the table and sighed, leaning against the counter. "I know you're worried about Carter," she said, her tone softer than usual. "It's smart to be cautious, but don't let it consume you. You're here to learn, Jack. Don't forget that." He nodded, grateful for her advice, but the tension in his chest refused to dissipate. Just as he was about to respond, the sound of hurried footsteps approached. Ben appeared in the doorway, breathless and wide-eyed. "Jack, we need to talk now." Lydia's expression shifted, recognizing the urgency in Ben's voice. She glanced between the two, her instincts kicking in. "I'll give you two a moment," she said, leaving with a last knowing look. Ben pulled Jack into the hallway, lowering his voice. "I found something," he said, handing Jack his phone. On the screen was a grainy photo of Carter outside a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, the timestamp from just an hour ago. "He's not just lurking around. He's meeting with someone, and I don't think it's good news." Jack's heart raced. The pieces were coming together, but the picture they formed was far from clear. "How did you get this?" he asked, eyes darting to Ben. His friend shrugged, a mischievous grin flickering for a moment. "Let's just say I know a guy who knows a guy. But that's not the point, Jack. If Carter is up to something and he's not acting alone, Mr. Donovan and the Foundation could be in serious trouble." The weight of the information settled heavily between them. Jack knew they couldn't ignore this. He glanced down the hallway, making sure no one was listening. We need to find out more. If Carter's working with rivals or planning something, we have to know before it's too late, Jack whispered, the determination in his voice surprising even himself. Ben's eyes widened with a mix of excitement and apprehension. Are you saying we should go check out? Jack nodded, feeling the reckless edge of urgency push him forward. Tonight. We don't have much time. An hour later, the two friends stood outside the warehouse, its shadow stretching out like a dark sentinel under the dim streetlights. The air was cold, biting at their skin as they exchanged a silent nod. Jack's pulse hammered in his ears as they crept closer, the gravel crunching softly under their feet. A side window, cracked open just enough, offered a view inside. What they saw sent a shiver down Jack's spine. Carter stood with a phone pressed to his ear, his voice raised in anger. No, we move forward as planned. Donovan won't know what hit him, he barked. Beside him, a tall figure with a scar running across his cheek smirked, arms crossed confidently. Ben's eyes met Jack's, both filled with the realization that this was bigger than they had imagined. Before they could pull away, the scarred man's gaze flickered to the window. His eyes narrowed, and Jack's stomach lurched. We need to go. Now, Jack hissed, grabbing Ben's arm and dragging him back into the shadows. They sprinted into the night, the sound of their own ragged breathing echoing in their ears. When they finally stopped, safe in the maze of alleyways behind the city's main street, Jack leaned against a brick wall, chest heaving. This is bad. Really bad, he panted, looking at Ben, who nodded, his face pale. What do we do now? Ben asked, the adrenaline starting to wane and fear creeping in. Jack swallowed hard, feeling the enormity of their next steps. We need to warn Mr. Donovan. He has to know what's coming. The next morning, Jack arrived at the foundation earlier than usual, the memory of the night seared into his mind. The building was quieter, a deceptive calm before the storm. He found Mr. Donovan in his office, already reviewing documents, eyes tired but focused. When Jack entered, Donovan looked up, surprised but attentive. Jack, this is early, even for you, he said, setting down a report. Jack took a breath, steadying himself. Sir, there's something you need to know. It's about Carter. Donovan's expression hardened, the lines on his face deepening. Go on. Jack recounted everything, from Ben's photo to their discovery at the warehouse. Donovan listened in silence, but the tightening of his jaw and the shadow that passed over his eyes betrayed his concern. When Jack finished, the room was thick with tension. Thank you for telling me this, Jack, Donovan said, standing up and moving to the window. The city sprawled below, oblivious to the drama unfolding above. Carter has always been a thorn in my side, but if he's planning something without side help, we need to act fast. Turning back to Jack, Donovan's expression was resolute. This changes things. You did well bringing this to me, but from here on out, it's going to get more complicated. Stay alert, and whatever happens, don't take unnecessary risks. Jack nodded, feeling the gravity of the situation settle deeper into his bones. As he left the office, a sense of foreboding wrapped around him. The battle was no longer one fought from the sidelines. He was in the thick of it now, and the stakes were higher than ever. The days that followed felt like a blur for Jack. The air at the Donovan Foundation was thick with tension as rumors of Carter's reappearance buzzed through whispered conversations and hurried exchanges. Jack kept his head down, continuing his tasks, but his mind was constantly racing, replaying the scene from the warehouse over and over. Every step, every word, felt like a countdown to an inevitable confrontation. One late evening, as the office began to clear out, Jack received a message from Ben. I have more info. Meet me at the park AC. Jack's pulse quickened as he read the words. The park was their usual meeting spot, a place that felt safe and familiar, but tonight it carried an edge of urgency. The city lights shimmered as Jack navigated through the maze of streets, the distant hum of traffic filling the silence. When he reached the park, Ben was waiting by the rusted swing set, pacing nervously. His breath formed small clouds in the chilly night air. "Jack, I found out who Carter's working with," Ben said, handing over a folder stuffed with papers and blurry photos. Jack flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning rapidly. Names and faces stared back at him, and one stood out, a name linked to a powerful corporate rival of Mr. Donovan. Jack's stomach twisted. This wasn't just about Carter trying to settle an old score. It was a coordinated attack involving powerful interests who wanted to see Donovan's foundation fall. "Ben, this is huge," Jack whispered, the realization crashing over him. Before they could say another word, the sound of footsteps echoed nearby. They turned to see a tall figure approaching, silhouetted against the glow of a street lamp. The scarred man from the warehouse. Jack's blood ran cold. Well, what do we have here?" The man's voice was deep, laced with mock amusement. "You two have been very busy, haven't you?" He took a step closer, his eyes flicking to the folder in Jack's hand. Ben clenched his fists, a mix of fear and defiance on his face. "Run, Jack," he muttered under his breath. But it was too late. The man lunged, snatching the folder from Jack's grasp. Jack stumbled back, his heart pounding as the man flipped through the pages with a smirk. "You should have stayed out of this, kid. Now you're in deeper than you think," he said, crumpling the papers and tossing them aside. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, a sudden shout came from behind them. "Step away from them." It was Mr. Donovan, flanked by two security guards who moved swiftly to intercept the man. For a moment, the park erupted in chaos. The scarred man tried to break free, but the guards overpowered him, pinning him to the ground. Donovan's eyes blazed as he looked at Jack and Ben, his expression a mix of anger and relief. "Are you both all right?" he asked, his voice tight with urgency. Jack nodded, still catching his breath. Ben, pale but steady, managed a weak thumbs up. Mr. Donovan's gaze shifted to the restrained man, who glared back with a defiant sneer. "You think this stops here? You have no idea what's coming." The man spat, his voice dripping with venom. Donovan's face hardened. "I know more than you think. And now so do they," he said, nodding toward Jack and Ben. The guards dragged the man to a waiting car, and Donovan turned to the boys. "Come with me. We need to talk." The drive to the Donovan estate was silent, the gravity of the encounter settling heavily over them. Once inside the grand study, Donovan poured himself a glass of water, his hands shaking slightly as he set it down. "I didn't want you involved, Jack, but now that you are, there's no turning back," he said, looking at both boys. Jack sat forward, the events of the night replaying in his mind like a movie. "Sir, who is he? And why is Carter doing this?" Donovan sighed, the weight of years of rivalry etched into his expression. "Carter was once an associate, someone I trusted, but greed and ambition changed him. He aligned himself with powerful people who wanted to take shortcuts to exploit what this foundation stands for. When I refused, it set off a chain of events that led us here." Ben shifted uneasily, breaking the silence. "And the man with the scars?" Donovan's jaw tightened. "An enforcer. Someone who does the dirty work for Carter's allies. He's dangerous, and now that he knows you two are involved, things might escalate." Jack's heart sank. The room felt colder, the reality of the danger sinking in. But he met Donovan's gaze, determination flaring in his chest. "What can we do to stop this?" Donovan's eyes softened, a hint of pride breaking through his stern exterior. "You're braver than most adults I know, Jack. But this isn't just about bravery. It's about outsmarting them." He pulled out a map and spread it across the desk, tracing a line with his finger. "There's a plan in motion, one that Carter and his associates won't see coming. But I need your help, both of you, Donovan said, looking at Jack and Ben. This foundation wasn't built alone, and it won't be protected alone. The room fell silent as the boys absorbed the magnitude of what was being asked. Jack glanced at Ben, who nodded, a nervous grin breaking through his exhaustion. "We're in," Jack said, his voice steady. The night was far from over, but for the first time, they weren't just reacting. They were preparing to face whatever came next. The plan was set into motion, each step carefully orchestrated under the cover of darkness. And as Jack stood on the balcony of the Donovan estate, looking out at the city lights, he felt the weight of the challenge ahead, but also a flicker of hope. They were no longer just two kids caught in the storm. They were part of the resistance, ready to fight for what was right. The morning sun cast a golden light over the city, illuminating the Donovan estate with a warm glow that seemed almost out of place given the tension within its walls. Jack stood by the large window of the study, watching the city awaken. The plan they had set into motion the night before was bold, risky even, but it was their best chance to expose Carter and his network before more damage could be done. Mr. Donovan entered the room, his face drawn but resolute. Behind him, Mrs. Eleanor appeared, her eyes softening when they landed on Jack. "You've done more than anyone could have expected, Jack," she said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. He nodded, the weight of her words settling deep in his chest. There was no turning back now. Ben arrived soon after, his usual carefree demeanor replaced by a serious focus. "Everything's set," he said, holding up a small device, a recording hidden within a pen. It was their secret weapon, containing the evidence they'd gathered about Carter's plans and his powerful backers. The goal was simple: catch Carter admitting his intentions and broadcast it to the right people, including Donovan's allies, who could move quickly to stop any threats. Hours later, they found themselves at a high-profile gala hosted by the Donovan Foundation. The event was bustling with influential guests, the hum of conversation mingling with the clink of glasses and soft jazz playing in the background. It was the perfect setting for a showdown, where Carter and his associates would least expect a counterattack. Jack's eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. The chandeliers above cast a glittering light across the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns. He spotted Carter by the bar, his demeanor relaxed, confident. But Jack knew better. Beneath that composed exterior, Carter was calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to make his move. "Remember, stick to the plan," Donovan whispered as he passed by Jack, a practiced smile on his face for the benefit of the guests. Jack nodded, his pulse quickening as he made his way toward Carter, who turned as he approached, an amused smirk playing on his lips. "Ah, the young hero," Carter said, lifting his glass in a mock toast. "Enjoying the party?" His tone was cordial, but his eyes glinted with something darker. Jack forced a smile, playing along. "It's quite the event," he replied, taking a step closer. He could feel the pen with the recording device in his pocket, a lifeline in the midst of the tense encounter. "I have to admit, I'm impressed with you, Jack," Carter continued, leaning in slightly. "Most kids would meddle in affairs they don't understand. But you have spirit. Misguided, but admirable." The words were a thinly veiled threat, and Jack felt a shiver run down his spine. Before Jack could respond, Mr. Donovan appeared beside them, the smile on his face not reaching his eyes. "Carter, glad you could make it," he said, his voice cool. The tension between the two men crackled in the air like a live wire. Carter chuckled, tipping his glass. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, Donovan. It's always a pleasure to see how the other half lives." The conversation shifted as Donovan steered it, guiding Carter into revealing more than he intended. The moments dragged on, each word a careful dance, until Carter's mask slipped, and he spoke too freely. "You think these people care about your noble causes, Donovan? They're just here for the show, for the power plays. And soon enough, they'll realize that power isn't yours to keep. It was the slip they needed, Jack's fingers brushed against the pen in his pocket, ensuring it was still recording. Carter's eyes narrowed, as if sensing something had changed. But before he could react, a commotion erupted at the entrance to the hall. Lydia, accompanied by security personnel and key allies of Mr. Donovan, stepped forward, holding documents and a laptop. This event is being broadcast live to the board members and stakeholders of the foundation, Lydia announced, her voice carrying over the sudden hush in the room. The screen behind her flickered to life, showing footage and audio of Carter's recent conversations, including the night at the warehouse. Gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd like wildfire. Carter's face contorted with rage as he lunged toward Jack, but Donovan was faster, stepping in and blocking his path. "It's over, Carter. The lies, the threats, they end tonight," Donovan said, his voice steady and unwavering. Security moved in, restraining Carter as he shouted threats that dissolved into incoherent curses. The room erupted in a mix of shock, relief, and whispered conversations. Jack felt Ben's hand on his shoulder, squeezing in silent victory. Mrs. Eleanor approached, her eyes misty as she pulled Jack into a tight embrace. "You did it," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. Jack's chest swelled with a sense of accomplishment and belonging he hadn't felt before. Mr. Donovan turned to Jack and Ben, his expression one of gratitude. "This foundation stands because of people like you, brave enough to fight for what's right." The room, now recovering from the drama, erupted in applause, acknowledging not just Donovan's triumph, but the courage of the young man who had risked everything. As the night wore on and the guests began to disperse, Jack stood on the balcony of his estate, the city's lights stretching out before him. The cool breeze carried with it the sounds of the celebration inside and the quiet murmur of a city that continued, oblivious to the battles fought within its heart. Ben joined him, leaning against the railing with a grin. "So, what now, hero?" Jack laughed, the tension finally leaving his body. "I don't know, but whatever it is, I'm ready for it," he said, looking out at the city with a newfound sense of hope. And as the first light of dawn painted the sky in hues of pink and orange, Jack knew this was more than the end of a battle. It was the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where he was no longer just a kid from the neighborhood, but part of something greater, a guardian of what was right, ready to face whatever came next. Now that you've followed this story full of twists and emotions, we'd love to hear from you. Comment below and share what you thought about the plot and which moment was your favorite or most gripping. Don't forget to leave a like. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. This way, you won't miss any new stories we share. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next story.